After 10 weeks away, we are back. Welcome to San Francisco, guys. I'm Dirty H, and it has indeed been a long time since I've been back in San Francisco. There was a few different reasons for this, but if you guys watch my other series, Europe in Detail, then you probably would have seen the latest little town I'm working on in that series. It's based on Spain, and I started building that when I stopped at the end of last year in San Francisco, and the reason is I was just so focused on that build. I think I had to be to pull it off properly, that I really just couldn't focus on anything else, and I wouldn't entertain the idea of coming into San Francisco if I wasn't going to do it justice. So my sincere apologies if you've been waiting, but I have come back strong. We have got a cracker of an episode here today. We tackle one of the most iconic parts of San Francisco in Pier 39, and I would have to say this is one of the most detailed and functional areas I've probably ever built in the game, and it really does perfect justice to the city. So before we get into Pier 39, let's work our way down the coastline here and develop this waterfront as we go. Now, following suit with the rest of the city, this is going to be a scaled down version of this waterfront. We see lots of big long piers out here, a lot of them are entertainment type piers, and in real life there's probably about 6 or 7 here, but I'm only going to be able to fit in 2 or 3, so I'm going to pick out the most iconic ones and try and replicate those in the game. I'm also going to add a couple of piers that we don't see in real life, just to add a little bit of entertainment to the area. But in terms of what I'm using from off the workshop, the big long pier here you see me putting down is called the Grand Pier, and it's made by the master Sven Berlin, and also Oceania has made these other really cool piers that are actually from San Francisco. And she has also made them so that they're all modular, which is just beautiful. We can put them together in any order that we want, and they look really good. So remember guys, I've got the collection linked in the description of this video, so if you're after anything like this, go and check out my collection. So we've worked our way northwards along the coast here, and I'm starting to run out of room before I reach where I want to put Pier 39. So I've decided just to put one more of Oceania's piers in here, and then develop a couple of little wee small areas between them, and then I can start setting out where the marina is going to go that's attached to the side of Pier 39. So first things first with Pier 39, and it's to terraform it out. And I want to try and get this in the right location. When we look down on Google Earth, it doesn't look like where you would imagine it to be. This angle that it's on, protruding out from the shoreline, just looks a little off to me. It just looks a little different, so I want to be sure to try and get that right. Even though this isn't going to be an exact replica of that pier, I want to get some things as close as I can, and I think the shape and size of it, or the scale in this particular instance, is going to be pretty vital. Now, because I want this functional as well, it means that I have to have this on real terrain. This may be a pier or a floating pier in real life, but in order for me to make this functional in the game of City Skylines, it means that I have to have it terraformed. But what I end up doing is putting these wooden piers by Oceania around the edge of them very strategically to try and make it look like it is on a floating pier. This is actually a cool little trick and requires just some very simple mods to be able to pull off, so you guys might be able to do something similar in your cities if you're playing along. Admittedly, I use procedural objects on mine because I'm going for a particular shape and style here, but if you're just going for a sort of whatever, then you could just work with these props as they come standard. Now that I've got the shape and the size of it pretty well where I want it, I can start building this marina off the side of it. This is also going to be a scaled down version of that marina. Obviously there's hundreds of boats in here in real life and I just couldn't fit them all in. But there's nothing too particularly noteworthy about this marina, but one thing that I have tried to copy is it looks like it comes off this particular part of the pier, perpendicular or at a right angle to the specific part here. So that's what I've tried to do here to make sure the marina is sort of facing the right way. And I'm using the same pier that we've been using around the edge, but I've just squeezed it down a bit with procedural objects and made it a bit thinner and put them here at a reasonably even space. Then eventually I'll use the same pier and turn it 90 degrees and create these little bays full of boats. And that's pretty much it for the marina. It's very simple, but I don't think I need to really add too much more to it. So once that's done, I can start putting the surface down on the pier where we're going to build. And I use a combination of surface networks and just the painter or the slabs, and generally just spend a bit of time getting this area ready to build on. So because we're not going to have any roads out on this pier, I really need to set up a little off-road here where I can make all of the services that may be needed for any amenities out on the pier to be collected from a little side road. I don't need to have the main road being clogged up by trucks having to drop off and pick up goods, and I'm going to use the spawn points mod to move the spawn point of all of these active buildings out on the pier to this one little side road here. So here you'll see me jiggle around a road and try and find the most appropriate place for that road, and initially I had it running right across the front of the pier, which ended up being a major brain fart. There was just no way I could make this work, so I ended up moving it right over to the right hand side of the screen, which I thought was still close enough to do the job of picking up and dropping off goods. I also want to make a point of having a tram stop directly out front of Pier 39 here, because eventually it's going to be a very busy area. So with the road all in place now and Pier 39 ready to build on, I can finish this last little piece of the waterfront between the last pier we put in and what we've built now. And using San Francisco, this exact spot in San Francisco, as inspiration, this is pretty much just a neat little wee walk around the very edge of the water and a few little very simple gardens here and there. For now, the path to the right is just sort of running off randomly, but eventually it will hook up to the path that runs right through Pier 39. I'm planning on having a lot of entertainment on offer out on the pier, and as such it's going to bring a lot of tourists into the town. So the idea here is, and thankfully this follows the real life plan too, is I'm going to have a lot of hotels around the waterfront here. There's 3 I'm going to put in particular here on these blocks, and they all have similarities, but I'm going to do my best to make all of them have their own individual character. Some of the staple things they may share are car parks and pools with maybe some green areas, and some of the things that may differ are the architecture between the hotels and maybe like things like decal patterns on the ground and the entrances into the actual hotel. I've tried to include some older Art Deco style hotels as well as some really contemporary modern ones, and hopefully we get a good contrast between the old and new. So 8 minutes in, we can finally start putting some of these buildings on the pier, and I've done my best here to gather as many amusement style buildings as I can, and a lot of these admittedly are the vanilla ones because they're perfect. They do lack a little bit of detail, but we are going to detail them up with some of my other props, so that's not a problem. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for any type of building with things like balloons or bright colourful facades. Maybe there's shops with some seats and benches out the front, and I'm really making a point to make all of the shops individual. No 2 shop fronts will be exactly the same type of facade. In saying that, however, it is worth noting that there is one style of building that you will see reoccurring right throughout the pier, and that is the American style building by Seabud. And I have used procedural objects on this building, and I've used this one to sort of marry these buildings together to make them look like they're all part of maybe one building. And from my observations on Google Earth, this American style building by Seabud is pretty close to the style being used. So it's probably about time to mention what Pier 39 is all about for those of you who don't know, and I was one of those people before I did any research into this. Basically, it's just a zone out on this pier which is really unique, with heaps of different places to eat and heaps of different attractions for yourself and maybe your family. And as much as I want to, and I'm trying here to follow that real life blueprint, but in order to make this functional in the game, or highly functional in this instance, it will require differing from what we see in real life somewhat. So with that said, I guess the end product here is a trade-off between those two ideas. It was virtually impossible for me to perfectly plan all of this, so that's why you've seen me start with the main things, like getting all the ground ready, then getting all of the main buildings in place and slowly build from there. You'll also notice here that I've doubled up these buildings and made them 2, sometimes 3 stories high. The real life Pier 39 is multi-leveled with activity happening on different levels right throughout the pier. So setting those buildings up on that second level means that I can now run this raised pedestrian path right around, so that I can eventually detail all of these areas up and have them functional with this path. So I'll now grab a couple of entertainment cubes and put them in a couple of places where I think it'll draw citizens up this pedestrian path. And before I do any detailing, I want to make sure it's actually going to work. So in true multi-zone style, I also slip a couple of high residential buildings in here because I know they won't complain about the noise. Cheers. If there was one iconic looking building out on this pier that I really wanted to nail, it was this one right here. I don't know the name of it or anything like that, but it looks pretty iconic to me. It's this hexagon shape here and it's got Pier 39 written all over it. And I have to say, I searched frantically to try and find something that I could use for this, and I just couldn't find anything, so I've pretty much made this from scratch. I've used a square building and a few props, as you may have seen at the beginning, and made this here, and I'm not stoked about it, but it's doing the job, I think. So after fluffing around with that for a while, I used Seabud's awesome Pier writing to finish it off with the name of this area proudly pronounced on the side of it. The last major building to go in is this one here, which in real life is a whale tour building. But in our version here, it's just going to be an extension of the area we've just built. This is because A, I want to build a separate whale tour later on in the series, and 2, this gives us a good opportunity to jam more commercial into this area. As it stands at the moment, I've got more than 400 jobs out here in just commercial alone, which is pretty cool, I reckon. So I finish off this raised pedestrian path by running it close to a couple of these roofs, and these areas will become second story balconies eventually. So as you can see, that path is in place now, there's people using it, so we can finally move on to adding the last bit of detail in here, and we go hardcore. And I really mean H to the C, hardcore, man. We jam this area up with more than 250 props, which is pretty crazy really. But hey, you only live once, right? So in terms of putting those props in the game, I used my little method that I've used earlier, which was to start with the main things or the most appropriate props and then work my way down the list. And the first port of call is making this raised path something more appropriate. And in real life, it's a timber raised path, and I'm using this one here from Ronix 69, which is just perfect. Then I use procedural objects to slip a few shop fronts in where appropriate, and then it's about adding things like benches and little planters with trees. And it took me a long time to do, even just what you're watching here on camera, which is literally just this very beginning of the pier here. But I knew that I'd have to be motivated and committed to the prop game, so I picked up my bottom lip and we carry on here with the rest of it. Now unfortunately, I had to use procedural objects for pretty much all of these shop facades. They had to fit very neatly, and changing them to procedural objects is the only way that I can scale them correctly to fit what I've built up to this point. For those of you that don't know too much about the mod procedural objects, I basically use it 99% of the time to change the shape of something. That is pretty much it. And most of the time it's not even the shape, it's just the size of it. So at this point all of our shop fronts are in, so let's dive in and really detail this up. This view will hopefully help give you guys an idea of the vibe I'm going for down here. I want lots of people, lots of stuff going on, heaps of things to look at, and just make it generally a place where you want to go and visit. As it stands at the moment, it doesn't really look too much like a pier because we've got our concrete on the ground, and that isn't really appropriate. We need to make this look like it has a timber floor on it, like a pier would appear in real life. So initially here you'll see me use a decal, but I didn't really like the look of this. It was too bright and just didn't look right, so eventually I used the same timber prop from Oceania that I used to create the piers around the boat area, and just overlay that across the ground, right across the pier, so it looks like we have that timber floor we're looking for. Unfortunately, this does create a little bit of clipping with the citizens. Their ankles sort of look like it's in the deck, but I really think this is a small price to pay for having this area really functional. So the last thing to do out here on the very end of the pier is just put in the last of these props. Things like little rides for children, trash cans, doors where appropriate, things like awnings and small arcade games, but also being sure to put down things like information signs and directional signs which help you navigate around the pier. We've made it to the last piece of proper infrastructure that I want to install on the pier itself, and we're moving back to this building here that I put in place of where the whale tours are in real life. And the reason I chose this building is because it's got a flat roof on parts of it where I want to run a pedestrian path so that I can create a second level on this building really easily with a commercial area on the roof. I'm really trying to work with the contours of this building and have the path run around the edge of this building really closely. The path that runs across and through this area will also meet up very directly with the one we've put in already, creating a really easy walk between the two second levels. In order for this whole area to work correctly in City Skylines, there's a couple of other little things that we have to install here, and thankfully they are also part of the real life San Francisco. So I have installed this massive parking garage here across the block, and I'm pretty sure this is a vanilla car park. It may be from a DLC, but this is following the real life San Francisco. This should also work pretty good in City Skylines and should be pretty appropriate. This gives the citizens the option to drive here. I guess the only thing that would be missing would be a walkway from the car park directly to the pier. And hey presto, would you look at that? There's one in real life, so let's put that in here. You'll see me here experiment with a couple of different types of paths, but in the end I settle for a concrete raised one, which looks pretty simple, but it's also pretty similar to the one that we see in real life. And I've tried to bring it into the pier here in the most efficient manner I could think of, which is basically just plumbing it straight into the end of the pier here, directly perpendicular to the stairs that lead up from the front. Now it's worth noting that this walkway actually doesn't run into the car park. I've made it loop into the car park and back out just out the front of it, right next to a metro stop. This metro stop runs directly from the Salesforce Transit Hub in downtown. So even though this path isn't servicing the car park directly, it is still going to play a massive part in getting people from that metro stop over to the pier. Pier 39 is officially complete within the series. I know there was many of you guys hanging out for this, so I hope I've done it justice. I feel like I have, and I'm really proud of it. It slips into the city really nicely. My biggest hope is though that I've inspired you guys to do something similar. I think I probably could have got it to look a little bit more like the real life one if I'd spent a bit more time on it, but in all honesty, it's a good trade-off having all of these people walking around and it being highly functional. I'd rather that than have it look exactly like something but be dead. It also looks really good at night, and there's still a lot of activity down there and lots of happenings and going ons, which is really cool to watch. I guess the only thing really missing now is something to bring all of these tourists into the town. And I wonder what could do the job there. I'll give you guys 3 words: watch this space. Thanks so much for giving me your attention for this episode, guys. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all your support and all your kind comments, and even the unkind comments. Just thanks for supporting me in general, guys. Look after yourselves, look after each other, and I will see you on the next episode of San Francisco. Peace.